I'm going to just share my screen, and this, of course, will work just great because it almost always does. There we go. Um, so it's Eclipse Day, isn't it? And it is, I'm going to do this. Yeah, it's a memorable day. So today is my daughter Caitlin's 39th birthday. And we sat at a local brew pub with our glasses that were passed out and watched the eclipse. And it is also the 45th anniversary of the day my wife and I met. So, and it's a really pretty day here in Hendersonville. So, buckle up. We're going to have quite a ride through my world of tomatoes, but I always like to start by showing people what are the gardens like in Hendersonville. And Hendersonville is a cute little town, Andy of Mayberry-ish, about 20 miles south of Asheville, in the mountains of Western North Carolina. And we're about at 2,500 feet elevation, which was a big surprise to me the first time I tried to make jam after moving here in 2020 and forgetting that and wondering why it never reached temperature. It's azalea time here. It's also redbud, dogwood, daffodil, tulip, and trillium time. And this is actually from a hike my wife and I took this morning where we did not expect to find these blooming. We've had warmer weather. We haven't had a flake of snow for 2 years, so everything seems to be advanced by a week or two. These are my seedlings for the year, and I'll talk a little bit later about my garden plans, but unlike the 70 plants I had last year, this will be the smallest garden I've had maybe since the second or third year of gardening, and I'll share some reasons for that if you want to know later. But I just started transplanting. These are plants that should be ready to go out around May 1st. This is some of the pictures of the spares that I'll be distributing to people who come by the house. And finally, before we get started on content, this is my future backyard garden in Hendersonville because it's our septic field. So in order to have a vegetable garden, we plant on top of it. And this will become a field of straw bales and containers that I'll show you in a bit. So here we are, 2024. An incredible time to be a tomato lover. When we first moved into Raleigh in 1992, we discovered their wonderful farmers market. And I got to take this picture, and it really depicts what the state of tomatoes were for a long, long time, meaning from the mid-1800s right up until the time that heirlooms really caught on. But I want to take you back even further. Let's go back to the mid-1800s, specifically this time 1840. Think about if we were a tomato enthusiast, which would have made us a very courageous person, because most Americans in the mid-1800s thought tomatoes were poisonous. And we went to our seed catalog and we flipped to T, and though we found a variety of squash and a variety of turnips, we would find tomato. So this is 1840. There's no description here, and it's the only one. So I would suspect tomato would have looked a lot like this. So where did tomato come to America? The tomato seemed to originate in Central and South America, was cultivated there, made its trip over to Europe in the 1580s with the Incan and Aztec conquests, unfortunately, but then it started traveling through Europe, making its way back to America, probably in the 1700s, more than likely looking like this. And isn't this interesting? This is a painting made in Spain in the 1700s. Doesn't it look like the ugly heirloom tomatoes that we crave today? So I've got a whole bunch of these pictures that I've found that show corrugated, creased, wrinkly tomatoes. This looks very much like the tomato Costoluto Genovese, if anybody has grown that. They're interesting looking. They're not the most delicious. There can be a lot of waste on them. But look what's happened since 1840. So I went back to that same farmer's market in 2019, just before we moved here, and I snapped this picture. Yellows, whites, oranges, stripes, greens, pinks, purples, browns. So how did we get to all of these tomatoes, and why are we so fortunate now in 2024 to have so much to choose from? It's because Kent Wheatley in 1975 noticed that the rush to produce hybrids, the first of which was Burpee's Big Boy in 1949, started leading to the disappearance of many, many tomatoes. So when Kent started the Seed Savers Exchange in 1975, it provided a mechanism of sharing treasures that families all over the world were holding just in their single gardens. So this is why we can grow so many today. In fact, if you were a Seed Savers Exchange member, you can choose from amongst 10 or 12,000 different named varieties of tomatoes, which is insane. So the first part of this talk is a bit of a travelogue through the tomato world. And the first maybe half of this talk is going to be helping to be a guide for you as these seed catalogs start coming in the mail and firing your enthusiasm for gardening. With so many tomato varieties available, how do you choose? And one of the things I want to get clear right off is it important? The question, is it important to try to find a local seed company because those varieties will be more locally adapted? Well, sadly, but realistically, the truth of the matter is the vast majority of seed companies source their seeds from all over the world. In fact, a lot of the seed production happens in Asia and Europe. There are some very small, very reliable local seed companies such as Southern Exposure Seed Exchange near Monticello that do grow a lot of their crops. But for the most part, Burpee's, Parks, Harris, they just can't grow it all, especially the hybrids, so they bring it in. It's more important to try different things in your garden to see what does well for you. So let's just get clear on some of the facts that you need to understand to help place different types of tomatoes in your garden to help you make the selection. Indeterminate, out of control, tall, grows beyond the useless tomato cage in about 2 weeks. 95% of tomatoes are indeterminate. The best flavored tomatoes tend to be. So you need a strategy for keeping them upright, for caging them, for keeping them under control, for pruning them and suckering them. Determinants are the tomatoes like Taxi or Roma that grow about 3 feet tall, put out a flush of blossoms, put out a lot of fruit, and they ripen that fruit within a very short time frame, and then you can just pull the plant and throw it away. They don't have the best flavors, but for making sauces and canning, there's some good choices, but there's not a lot of varieties available. The dwarf tomatoes, which is a third distinct type, and a lot of people will ask me, so are dwarfs indeterminate or determinate? I'll tell them dwarfs are dwarf. They're a third type that share the compact growth habit of determinants with the season-long fruiting and potential great flavors of indeterminants. Very few of them were known until we did our project, and I'm going to talk more about them in a minute. So those are terms you need to understand. What is your physical capability to take care of a really tall plant? What is the space you have available? Now, the other term that's important is hybrid, open pollinated, and heirloom. Hybrid, and many people know about Sungold. It's probably my favorite tasting tomato. Hybrids are the seeds that are produced when someone in a greenhouse, typically in Europe or Asia, understand that pollen from one parent, when applied to the flowers of the other parent, produce a tomato whose seeds are the hybrid seeds. Each seed is from a handmade cross, and when those seeds are planted, they produce tomatoes that are greater than the sum of the parts. They can never be heirlooms because if you save seed from a hybrid and grow it, you don't get the same thing back. You get an array of possibilities. Heirlooms are varieties that are genetically stable through years of growing. Cherokee Purple is one of the better known ones. All heirlooms are open pollinated. Open pollinated is really a term that means the opposite of hybrid. It's genetically stable. But not all open pollinated are heirlooms because many are being created now, such as Green Zebra from the 1970s, Black Cherry from the 1980s, all of our dwarf varieties from 2010 and beyond. I call them tomorrow's heirlooms. I want to know that in 50 years, people are still going to grow and collect and share them. So one of the great things about growing heirlooms in your garden is being able to share and distribute the seeds into seed libraries or your friends or other seed savers, or just to keep for yourself to regrow them. But it allows you to use your gardens to tell stories. And by doing so, you can grow a gardener if they find this a really captivating, delicious, interesting pursuit to try. This is the story of Cherokee Purple. And when I first received this tomato seed in 1990 with no name, it came with this letter. I grew it, and this color was not known at that time. So it was something really, really unusual. And the history of this variety is that the Cherokee Nation shared seeds with the grandfather of Gene Greenlee of Rutledge, Tennessee. I don't have his first name, sadly. It's like genealogy. You don't ask all of the questions while the people are around to ask them. But Grandpa Greenlee shared them with his granddaughter. And at some event, she passed some seeds on to a man named John D. Green, who lived in Sevierville, Tennessee, interestingly, not too far from where I live to the west. He wanted to share these with someone, and so he chose me. And I received them, grew them, loved the flavor, loved the color, named it Cherokee Purple, and sent it to Jeff McCormick of Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. He grew it, and then he called me the next year, and he said, Craig, I'm really concerned. I love the name, I love the story, I love the flavor, but it is so ugly. I don't think that American gardeners are going to accept eating a tomato that looks like that, but I'll tell you what. I'm going to put it in my 1993 seed catalog with a caveat, only for the very adventurous. And here we are in 2024. I could probably go to any farmer's market now in the country and find this tomato. So it is a stunning coincidence, serendipity at its finest, that this tomato landed with me. But think about if any of the links in the chain didn't happen. If the tomatoes weren't passed on from the Cherokee Nation, if Grandpa Greenlee didn't pass it on, if J.D. Green didn't send it, if Jeff McCormick didn't sell it. So this story typifies what I love about heirlooms, and what I worry about heirlooms is the stories you can tell, often the interesting colors and flavors, but the fragility. Seeds are living things, and if you don't keep growing them, they can go extinct. As far as dwarf tomatoes, every tomato on this plate came from a plant that's 3 or 4 feet tall. I officially ended the project on the significant scale we were running it at the end of 2023. It's ticking along to finish some promising leads. But in those 19 years, we've had over 1,000 volunteers, all amateur, all volunteer, and all paid the same as the rest of us in the project, which is 0. However, if you find something great and you get to name it, your name ends up in a seed catalog. We've had volunteers from all 50 states, from 25 countries. We now have 157 varieties in seed catalogs, and in fact, Victory Seeds carries them all. So what is a dwarf tomato? It is a tomato that grows upward at half of the rate of an indeterminate. So when people ask me specifically how tall a particular variety will grow, all I can say is it will end up half the size of the tall tomatoes in your garden. So if in your garden, and plant height really depends on how you stake it, prune it, your weather, the temperature, degree days, the size of the plant when you plant it. But if you have an 8-foot Cherokee Purple in your garden at the end of your growing season, you will have a 4-foot dwarf. And the more direct sun you get, the shorter it will stay. But, and that April 5th, November 1st, ignore that. That was from a prior talk, and that was for California. But you have a long growing season as well. But the plants have these crinkly, dark bluish green leaves. They're gorgeous plants. Often people really comment just on how beautiful you are. And these dwarfs here, this is during the project in my driveway. They're in 5-gallon grow bags, and they yield just fine. And just to show you a few of them, in the upper left, we have Sweet Sue, which I named after my wife, and it is a 6 to 8 ounce, superbly delicious yellow that is slightly on the sweet side. Speckled Heart, which is scarlet, 6 to 8 ounces, golden stripes, not only good for sauce and paste, but delicious for putting on sandwiches. Fred's Tie-Dye, which is a Cherokee purple colored tomato with green and gold streaks, and a new color we invented, or discovered, I should say. Uluru Ochre is a black, the first of the black-orange tomatoes. It has that dusky coloring, the green gel on the seeds, and the shoulders that are dark colored, but it's orange. So as I said, the primary public availability of these is through Victory Seeds, formerly owned by my friend Mike Dunton in Molalla, Oregon. And then he actually sold it a year ago to his friend Dave Whitinger, who is National Gardening Association manager, Dave's Garden. And he and his family now run the company with the same care and concern for historical accuracy and quality that Mike did. And if you look at their dwarf tomato page, it carries all 157, and you can alphabetize it and learn more about these. So before we get into culture, troubleshooting, what can go wrong and how to make it right, this is kind of a fun little section I've put in to talk about whether there is a correlation between tomato color and flavor, because we now have the ability to grow tomatoes of so many different colors. After growing somewhere around 4,000 different tomatoes in my 40 years of gardening, I can honestly say there is not a correlation. We eat with our eyes, which may impact how we feel about a tomato, but having done blind tastings through the years and tasted so many, each tomato variety is as unique as each one of us. A unique package of genes. We have different eye color, hair color, height. Tomatoes each are coded genetically for their own particular flavor. So let's say you favor a sweeter tomato. You can go for the pink, deliciously sweet Anna Russian in the upper left, White Queen, which is the color of a sheet of printing paper and makes the coolest white tomato sauce. A very well-known heirloom, Kellogg's Breakfast in the upper right, Eva Purple Ball in the lower left, where each tomato looks like a perfect tennis ball and completely blows away this whole reputation of the ugly heirloom from the Black Forest region of Germany in the 1800s. The gorgeous yellow-red bicolor types, of which Ruby Gold is pictured here, which to me, if I were to blind eat the yellow-red bicolors, I would think I was eating a peach, because they have the texture and the aroma and the flavor and the sweetness of a peach, but they're really good in a cheeseburger. And German Johnson, which is really the only known North Carolina heirloom. But if I have to swear to what my favorite type of tomato is, it's this category. It is the intense tomato that when you take a bite, the flavor lingers for a minute, and they would maybe scare those who are not sure if they like tomatoes because their flavor is just so assertive. But it would be Lillian's Yellow Heirloom or Dwarf Barrel Beauty, which is a tomato that stays green when it's ripe, and it tastes like the best red tomato you've ever had. And the lower left is Nepal. And that is the tomato that converted me from hybrids to heirlooms when I first grew it in 1987. Johnny Selected Seeds still sells it. It is still a spectacular tomato, even though it just looks like an ordinary supermarket tomato. Another one of our dwarfs in the lower center, Rosella Purple, and that's Cherokee Chocolate on the right, which is a tomato that came from a skin color mutation of Cherokee Purple in my Raleigh garden back in 1995. When we were selling plants, one of the questions that we were often asked was, I want a tomato that tastes like a tomato. I want it to be acidic. This is when I used to eat tomatoes out of my grandparents' garden. I remember the acidity really sticking out. And those types of tomatoes are not actually as easy to find these days, but they're still there. So Tiger Tom in the upper left, sometimes known as Tigerella. Green Zebra is a tart tomato. Probably one of the 5 tartest tomatoes I've ever eaten is Ozoichka, a Russian tomato that came into the Seed Savers Exchange collection in 1990. And I was amongst the first to grow, and I love it still in the upper right, about an 8-ounce bright yellow. One of our dwarfs, Dwarf Mr. Snow, in the lower left, is incredibly tart. And being a white tomato, it just completely blows your mind that it would be like that. Dwarf Blazing Beauty, same color as Kellogg's Breakfast, but at the total opposite end of the flavor spectrum, being delightfully tart. And that acres West Virginia, and the lower right is just the typical beefsteak red tomato that you'd find at a farm stand when you went out on a Sunday afternoon with your grandparents to get some produce for your cookout. So hopefully this will give you a little bit of a guide to that flavor color correlation, give you some ideas. And at the very end, I'm going to show you lists of my favorite flavored dwarfs and indeterminates. But also now, hopefully, what I've just presented will help you decide what you may want in your garden based on the tomatoes' growth characteristics, plant height, whether you can save seeds or not from it, or the colors and the flavors. So now we're going to turn to how we can make this all happen. We're going to take you from tomatoes seed to harvest. And I have to tell you right off the bat, I am often a rule breaker. And this is the way I actually start my seedlings, which does break a lot of rules. So we're going to go over a few very important principles first. When I say size matters, what I mean is when you're looking in your yard for where you're going to plant your tomato plants, if you want to grow the 2-pound mortgage lifters, such as that tomato on the left, you need to really think about the need for this variety to have 8 hours of direct sun a day, or else the yields will be disappointing and the plant will just be out of control, humongous. So if you get 6 hours of sun a day, you're pretty good, right up to 12 ounces, maybe even 1 pound. But even if you only get a couple of hours of sun on your back patio or deck, you can grow a cherry tomato or a tomato up to the size of a golf ball or even a little larger. But this is your guide that as you're choosing tomatoes, the largest fruited ones need the most sun by far. So some really key slides here. For where you're gardening in Virginia Beach, any variety will work. It really is all about the dates and the weather. Understanding when there's going to be no more frost, that will give you guidance to when to start your seeds, which we'll go into. And then thinking about when the first frost will be, which will not only help you decide what kind of maturity date tomatoes you want to choose, but will you have the time to succession plant your tomatoes and double crop it or more? So when I was in Raleigh, this slide was really important, which is why I created it and put it in. And for you, it's equally important, if not more so. The effect of hotter, more humid temperatures on tomatoes tend to exhibit their influence of successful fruit set, disease movements in the area. It can even affect critter movements, and definitely the culture and care of your tomatoes. So if you look at that picture on the right, it looks like something has come and snipped off those 2 blossoms. But actually what happened, this is a large fruited variety, and it was probably in blossom during a period where there were extended periods of 90 degrees or above with humidity. Large fruited tomatoes of a pound or more do not like those conditions, and the flowers will open and the pollen will have difficulty getting into the tip of the pistil, and pollination won't happen. The flower will dry up and drop off. So if you see periods of 90 or above coming and you're growing some very large fruited tomatoes, you want to gently flick your blossoms a few times a day, or get an electric toothbrush and just buzz the blossom clusters a few times a day gently. Maybe even set up a little bit of shade cloth to influence the microclimate and temperature around your tomatoes and drop it a few degrees. That will actually increase your yield of your large fruited tomatoes. This is like a menu of tomato success, and then we're going to get into some specifics. But so this is the, if tomatoes were on a dating site, what would a tomato say that they liked? They like warm roots. They like adequate water. So this whole thing that went around about dry farming tomatoes, that's fine if you're in the ground. But if you're in a container or a straw bale or even a raised bed where you don't have areas for the roots to pass through, you'll get blossom end rot because the tomatoes will not get enough water if you're not there to help it, or if you don't have drip set up, and they will get stressed. Good drainage. Tomatoes absolutely hate wet feet, and we'll look at a slide about that. They do like regular feeding, and they do like regular attention. So my view is the most successful gardens, you go in and get to know your plants. What do they look like when they're healthy and happy? What is the effect of that midday sun on them? What do the plants look like then? If the foliage starts fading out in color, it's telling you that it needs a nutrient of some sort. If you're missing leaves, or you've got holes in leaves, or your leaves are curling, or your blossoms are dropping off, the plant is telling you that it needs something. So tomatoes are extremely resilient plants, but things do get to them, and we'll cover quite a few of those. So I showed you the calendar a little while ago. So my target plant out date here in Hendersonville is May 1st. So I started transplanting my plants from clusters that I'll show you in a moment into single pots on April 1st. And I did the majority of my seed planting on March 1st. This mnemonic type of a 1 month, 1 month for key steps has helped me a lot, and it's always worked. Other key success factors for starting your own seed is to use a sterile soilless mix, something that absorbs water well, drains well, but the sterile is important because that means you won't be prone to damping off disease, which is what happens when your tomato germinates. Everything looks good, and then one day all of your little plants start getting tipped over, and there's the stem is constricted where the stem meets the soil. That's a fungus that's in that planting mix that just chopped off your plant. I love to use SunGrow propagation mix or SunGrow's Metro Mix 830, but there's a zillion different good starting mixes. Seed companies sell them, garden centers sell them, but I think soilless mix is a key. I dry fill my flats. You could do this with a container, with egg crates, make sure you have holes in the bottom, but I dry fill and then wet. Saturate that mix with warm water, will flow through the best. I have it within a 1/4 inch of the top of the container, and then I sprinkle seeds on the top. And then I take dry mix and sprinkle it on until I can't see the seeds anymore. So that's about a 1/32 of an inch deep. I then mist, and I loosely put a sheet of saran wrap on top. Or if you have a dome, you could do that. One thing I want to make clear, two things actually. I plant now up to 50 seeds or more per cell. So tomatoes don't mind. And this was born out of the need to get thousands of plants to sell in Raleigh with no greenhouse. This way I could get 2,000 seedlings in a 1x2 foot footprint. I just then had to separate them. And I love the process of transplanting that I'll talk you through in a moment. The other thing is that a heat mat helps, and tomatoes done this way germinate very quickly, 3, 4, 5 days. But I also do this with peppers and eggplant and herbs and flowers and beets and greens. The dense planting technique with transplanting works well for everything that I've tried it on. The only thing I don't do it on are large seeded plants like cucumbers and squash and melons and beans that I direct seed, because warm soil will germinate them in a jiffy. The other last point I want to make in this slide is that tomato seeds last for many years. They'll just stored in back of me are lots of coin envelopes with seeds, 12 to 14 years. And when you get around year 12, you'll start seeing them slow down a little bit and the germination will drop off. And then at 14 or 15 years, they just go off a cliff and die. They no longer will germinate. But if you were to put them in plastic, put them in the fridge, they'll last for 20, 25 years or more. Put them in the freezer, they'll last for 25 to 50 years. So they sell packets of seeds that have 25, 30, 50 seeds. Plant what you need, just store them in your office, and they'll be fine for the next 8 or 9 years after that to share. So here's a picture of them, and this is in this house. So I've got my book rack behind me. I've got one flat that I just planted on the left. It's still got the saran wrap on that I flip every day, because if you're on a heat mat, it's going to generate heat, which causes condensation. And when I flip it daily, I always want the dry side on the soil. And what happens when the seedlings, the vast majority of the seedlings germinate? I remove the plastic and make sure that they're well watered. I don't mind top watering at this point because this is sterile mix. it's okay to get the foliage wet. It's only once they're growing out in your yard and transplanted that you want to keep the foliage dry. So these were planted, the seeds were planted on February 28th, and this is what they look like on March 6th. And I did plant some older seeds, so there's some blanks in here, and that's fine. They're in front of a window. They'll exhibit phototropism. So pretty quickly, you want to get them either under lights, could be LED lights, could be fluorescent lights, with the distance of the light to the seedlings based on the recommendation of the device. So for fluorescent lights, like on the top here, they run very cool. So I can lower those tubes within 1 inch of the tops of the seedlings. That will keep them from getting really leggy. I haven't used LED lights that much, but there's lots of information to Google about that. I actually don't use lights much at all anymore. I've started, and you could definitely do this where you are. I'll pick a day where it's 45 degrees or so and not windy and not raining. And I'll find a place where there's filtered sun and put them in for an hour or so and then take them in. And the next day they'll get 2 to 3 hours. Within a week, the seedlings are hardened off even before you separate and transplant them. And they don't lose that hardening off character. So even you'll separate these and transplant them into individuals, but you don't have to start the hardening off process again. So this is risky, but there is significant payoff just by understanding where the light falls in your yard, focusing initially on places with filtered sunlight, and eventually getting them into full sun. Always being ready to get them in the house if you're going to have frost that night or heavy rain or wind. In terms of separating these seedlings into separate plants, tomato seedlings are very tough and resilient. As you're separating them, this nice soilless mix breaks apart. You may break a few roots here and there, but it doesn't matter because any part of the tomato stem planted under the mix will root quickly. I fill whatever pot that I want to use. These are strips of 18 3.5 inch plastic that are connected by perforations. They're easy to get apart. And I fill with the same dry mix I use as a seed starter. Then I lay the plants on and ease them in with my finger until all of the stem is covered. I transplant them into dry mix because if you water this down, you stiffen it up. And as you're pressing those plants in, it is very likely that you're going to break some stems. By doing it this way, you don't break any stems. The plants ease right in. Once they're in, then you water them very well. And I deep plant everything when I transplant it. So, I've been asked a lot, do you do this with peppers? Do you do this with eggplant? Do you do this with lettuce? I do it with everything. Covering the stem may not necessarily lead quickly to roots growing off the stem, but you're protecting the most tender part of the plant. And when you get them outside, you don't want to have a lot of exposed stem blowing around or being exposed to the sun when they're really young. So this works great. Once you get your transplanting done, you don't want to get them right out into the sun. So I actually get these into the garage. I may raise the garage door for an hour or two each day, but they're fine in here. And I usually leave them in here up to 3 or 4 days because I don't want them to get sunburned. And these plants are now trying to find their way in this new planting mix, and they're not going to take up water right away. You can desiccate and kill the plants if you were to put them right outside. You notice another thing I've learned, if you're transplanting quantities of varieties, I just put 1 tag per pot, and then on a nice day where I don't feel like transplanting, I'll sit down with my pen and labels and I'll write out all the rest of the labels. But that transplanting, getting them settled in the shade is really important before you get them out in the sun. So now some key success factors in a traditional garden. When we lived in Raleigh, I hand dug this garden out of clay. It was no fun, but you can plant in clay as long as you work in lots of compost and organic matter. It holds nutrients and moisture. And for maybe 20 out of our 28 years, I had a really good garden until the loblolly pines and the tulip poplars grew too tall and shaded me out. But it was good dirt. And what can go wrong in a garden like this? A drainage issue. So tomatoes don't like wet feet, neither do peppers, neither do eggplant. So if it rains, and you have holes that fill up with water and take a day to drain, you need to do something about your soil substructure, loosen it up, get drainage going. You look at your plants and they look like they need water, but actually they're suffocating. Mulching is so important because garden soil is filled with all kinds of microbes and agents, some of which are disease agents, such as early blight and septoria. And what you want to do with a tomato is build in quality right up front. So do everything you can to bring that plant along as healthy as possible, because it is inevitable that something's going to get to it over time. And some of those somethings we'll talk about. But by mulching, and I use untreated grass clippings, but I've also used shredded leaves. I've used newspapers with slits cut in them. The key is you want water to be able to get through and air to be able to get through, but you're forming a physical block to prevent soil from splashing up on your leaves and starting the inevitable speckling. Watering and feeding, if you're in a traditional garden, roots can go down and find water. So I water at the base of the plant, so the water goes where it's needed and it gets right to the root zone. Using sprinklers, a lot of the water will evaporate, but you're also getting your foliage wet, and wet foliage is a magnet for the disease spores that are flying around in your garden, coming in from anywhere and everywhere. In a traditional garden, I'm letting my plants tell me when they're wet. So you could have rainstorm, regular rain. The plants, I always look at the plants when they're pretty big at the hottest part of the day. And if they're not wilting, then everything's cool. If they are wilting significantly, you need to water them. Feeding is kind of the same principle. In a traditional garden, you can feed your plants and the nutrients will get into the root zone and probably hang around there for a while. So I'm looking at my foliage color and I'm looking to see they're blossoming and setting fruit. I am not a fancy feeder. I just use a general all-purpose, whether it's a slow release granular or water soluble. I'm not fancy about my NPK ratios. I pretty much use the same thing throughout the season and I've had great results. But, and this is maybe the time to say this, in this talk, I'm sharing with you what I do. If you do something that's different and it's working great for you, keep doing it. You put 100 gardeners in a room, you'll have 100 different gardening philosophies, 100 different ways to feed and water a plant. If you're getting great results, stick with it. I like to share things that I've done so that if you're not getting great results, I may spark an idea with you to try something. So in terms of container gardening, wonderful technique. Anything that holds soil and has holes in the bottom will grow anything, not just tomatoes. And I do a talk on container and straw bale gardening where I show pretty much how I've grown everything I want to eat in containers or straw bales, but they work particularly well for tomatoes. Plastic, and those pots that look like terracotta are plastic pots that I've had for over 30 years. I love the black plastic grow bags like that one on the left because they're less than $1 each. They last for 15 years or more. I get them from Peaceful Valley in Albany, Oregon. Their website is agroworganic.com. They've got holes pre-punched in the bottom, and you can empty them out and just fold them up and have easy storage. Self-watering containers are great. I won't tell my gardener supply story, but let's just say that when Epic tomatoes came out, they sent me some of these to test. They weren't fully worked out yet, but they were very generous to send them to me. And I guess the punchline of the story is they found out that when I review a product, I'm extremely honest, and they haven't asked me to review much since then. However, these work great. They may not have been the easiest things to put together, and they may still have had some kinks that needed working out, but they're expensive. And each gardener has to decide where they're going to spend their gardening money. Will it be on gardening supplies and things, or will it be on seeds? Will it be on soil? How these work, they're like earth boxes. There's water at the bottom, a reservoir, and a bag, a porous bag of garden planting mix and a wick that allows the plants to draw that water from the reservoir. So you can fill the reservoir with water, any excess comes out, go away on your vacation, your plants will be fine. So they're really a great invention. The big success factor in container gardening is the quality of what you put in the containers. And I like to put in a roughly 3-to-1, it could be 4-to-1. It's not precise ratio of a good quality soilless mix. Lately, I've been using Stay Green potting mix that I get at Lowe's. It's about $11.50 for 2.8 cubic feet, which is really good. The Miracle Grow that I would occasionally use is now $18 or $20 for 2 cubic feet. It's a good product, but it's really super expensive. I use Black cow manure for the one. So 3 to 4 parts of the soilless mix, 1 pot of the Black cow manure, and I'm sure there are hundreds of organic options, strictly organic options for potting mixes and compost. I think the other key here is, can I reuse the potting mix? And if you read Epic Tomatoes, I'm sure I said in there, please don't reuse mix for tomatoes because they're so disease sensitive. But then in the intervening years, I wrote that mostly 2012, 2013. I've done 11 years of gardening since then. And I've learned that if the plants do well in your containers, then that planting mix is just fine to plant tomatoes in the next year. The only time now I toss my mix is if some dire root vector disease, such as fusarium wilt, somehow gets into that soil and kills your plant. You don't want to use that the next year. Drip irrigation, of course, is the perfect solution for containers because when you're container gardening tomatoes, they're going to be thirsty. So you're going to be watering regularly. For indeterminate tomatoes in 10-gallon pots, when they're really going strong, I'm probably watering every day. And I have a hose with no attachment on the end, and I'm watering them the count that the gallon capacity of the container is. So 10-gallon pot I count to 10. With drip irrigation, you can titrate in the water that tomato needs to be able to get through the hottest part of the day without looking unduly stressed. This is the picture that shows why the Homeowners Association in Raleigh were driven crazy by us, because I would have 225 containers in my driveway, which was entirely visible from the road. I think somewhere in the covenant, this was a no-no, but I found that you can kill them with kindness. And if you offer your friendly HOA members great tomatoes and explain to them that a garden like this where people can see you working in it is a great teaching tool. I may have had some envious gardeners that weren't able to do this, but this became like a little laboratory and teaching room in the years that we lived in Raleigh. Straw bale gardening, absolutely wonderful. It's become my favorite way of gardening because when I look at this straw bale, I see 220-gallon container capacity of perfect future loam, no diseases in it. The one caveat being, it is possible to get a straw bale that has persistent herbicides in it. It's not common. And in the 10 years I've been straw bale gardening, 400 bales I've used. I've had 2 that have killed my plants. They came from a big box store like a Lowe's or a Home Depot. So if you stick to smaller gardening centers, you should do fine. The concept of straw bale gardening is to turn your straw bale into perfect loam, a perfect place for the roots of your plants to be. So what this means is it takes 2 weeks to do that process of turning this from a dry, hard, light straw bale to a heavy, wet, workable straw bale ready to put your plants into. It's heavy applications of nitrogen on alternating days for a week. And when I mean heavy application, I mean a half a cup of a 2805 lawn starter. So you're really charging this up with nitrogen. And then comes a cup of a balanced food, like a 10-10-10 granular. Water, every day you're watering it in. 2 weeks from the time you start this process, you can plant them. And you can start them early and then let them sit for a couple of weeks before you plant them. So the whole key is getting them going. So one of the things I've learned, if you're going to do straw bale gardening, you have to appreciate the ink cap mushrooms that pop up continuously for a week or 2. So doing this with children would be a wonderful thing. Every morning, it's filled with mushrooms. The sun comes out, they all go away. So this is 3-inch seedlings planted in straw bales on May 8th. And these are those same 3-inch seedlings 2 weeks later. So the heat generated by the centers of these straw bales push the plants, reduce maturity dates. You can direct seed into straw bales by putting a 3-inch layer of potting mix on them and putting in bean seeds, squash, melon, cukes. I picked my first summer squash last year, 37 days from direct seeding in a straw bale, and I have never lost a summer squash plant to the squash vine borer when I use straw bale. So there's just a few check marks why you might want to try them. This is a look down Tomato Alley last year, where I've got my 2 indeterminate tomato plants per straw bale supported by 8-foot stakes. So if you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, you need to think about a suckering strategy. And suckers are neither good nor bad. They are a constant with indeterminate tomatoes. They appear at every intersection of the main stem, vertical, and the leaves, which come out horizontal. At a 45-degree angle, out comes your sucker. Every intersection. So what I do is I think, how many suckers do I want to let grow? Because if let's say you have an 8-foot tomato plant and you want to prune every sucker off, your yield will be 10 pounds. It's going to flower every 10 inches or so. Once you get to the top, that's it. If I let just one sucker grow, my potential yield is now 20 pounds. If I let a third sucker grow, my potential yield is now 30 pounds. So allowing suckers to develop is a way to increase the yield of your plant, but you also have to sucker the suckers because they are just additional stems. And what are suckers good for? They are good for cloning your plant. And so let's say somebody comes into your yard and they love your Sun Gold and they don't have a plant. They can't find one to purchase and they don't have any seeds. Well, you can just take a Sun Gold sucker, it roots in water in a week, pot it up for them, and they now have Sun Gold. The other thing you can do is you can bring along a set of your indeterminate plants as a backup or as a succession planting. If you can figure a way to get 2 growing seasons in, then you can bring, and you love the tomatoes that you grew the first time, by using suckers, you can bring along a set of tomatoes to replace those if disease or heat or critters get to them. So what happens? What does a garden look like if you don't sucker it and you don't top your plants? And topped plants, meaning when they get to the top of whatever height support you use, you just snip the growing tip. Hopefully you'll have some suckers growing up that will then start adding yield to the plant. That prevents the inevitable plant from going up and over, getting really heavy and lopsided, and then having a storm come and pull your stake down. Just top them. Plant will not mind at all. But the plant, this is when I did not do a good job suckering or pruning, and I ended up with pickup sticks. And if you look carefully, there are chairs holding up plants and ladders and tables. So when Joe and I shot the videos for our Growing Epic Tomatoes course, I wanted to really practice what I preached. And I suckered regularly and I topped, and I ended up with a very well-behaved garden. When you have plants falling all over each other, you're creating areas where disease can develop and critters can find the fruit instead of you. So what can go wrong? Troubleshooting. If you see the brownish, papery looking spots, particularly in areas of your plants that are low on the plant, inside or on the backside, places where the sun doesn't reach, this is alternaria or early blight. It's a fungus that's everywhere. Everybody who grows tomatoes in this country will experience this. The flip side of the leaf actually has the spore. So the key thing is to get the leaves with these spores off the plant. Septoria leaf spot looks like this. And these are the small brown speckles with the yellow zones that get your foliage. Same thing. This is a different fungus, but acts the same way. It's triggered in slightly different conditions in early blight. I don't spray anything. I just carefully look at my plants every day or every other day. And as soon as I start seeing blemishes, I just snap off the leaves and don't compost it, because there are spores on those leaves. Just destroy those leaves, put them somewhere way back in your woods or bag them up. But by doing that, you can avoid using the sprays, because early blight and septoria will not kill a plant if you can keep up with this. Now, late blight is a different story altogether. And late blight can be tricky to identify. It doesn't happen every year. It almost invariably comes from infected potatoes growing somewhere near your garden. The late blight fungus is what was responsible for the Irish potato famine. So on the left, you see a leaf where the early blight showing the characteristic concentric rings, a target appearance. If you see something that's more like a uniform brown lesion with a ghostly light greenish zone around it, or you start seeing and big blotches of brown in your stems, you need to get any plants that show that out of your garden. Now, the good news is late blight needs living plant tissue. So it will not be in the leaves that you leave in your garden over the winter that freeze, but it needs something living to feed on. And if you have people in the area that allow their potatoes to just grow from tubers left in the ground, they can get infected and then spread it into your area. Maybe the most depressing thing, well, late blight is probably the most depressing thing. But this is one of the common depressing things, is when your plants are looking great, and then all of a sudden you notice one day, even though they're well watered, they start wilting. And then a day later, they're not only wilting, but the leaves are turning bright yellow. That's fusarium wilt. And that means that the fusarium fungus is in the soil, attacking that plant through the roots and shutting off water transport in the plant. Now, occasionally, fusarium is a weird disease because you could get one stem of a plant that has it and then another stem of the plant that doesn't. So it's up to you whether to get that plant out of the garden. The important thing to know is you have spores in that living in the soil where that plant was. So you have to rotate away from that. Or you can just put a piece of landscape fabric in that area if it's a really good sunny spot, and just plant there in a container or a straw bale, just preventing the roots from that plant from getting into that infected soil. And within 3 or 4 years or so, the fusarium will have burned out of the soil, and then you can plant back there again. Another problem you can get are the very hungry. People are squeamish about these big fellas, the tomato or the tobacco hornworm. If they look like the big one in the center, get them off your plant, put them in your bird feeders, destroy them, but just get them off your plant because they'll eat a lot and they'll eat fast. It's not just little parts of your leaves that are missing, it's whole branches that will be missing. However, if you see something on your plant that looks like the inset picture in the upper right, it means the pupa of a parasitic wasp is present there. And those pupa will hatch their little babies that will eat that hornworm from the inside out, and the wasps will fly about the garden and lay their eggs and other hornworms. So these are camouflage, particularly on tomato plants. That big picture shows it on a pepper plant. But if you just buy an inexpensive battery-operated UV light and go out into your garden at night, not only will you amaze and probably scare the crap out of your neighbors as they see this purple light moving about the garden, turning the plants all purple, the hornworms light up fluorescent green, and you can locate them and get them off your plants. So this works really well if a stubborn, impossible to find hornworm has been devouring your plant. Go out at night and find it. I talked quite a bit early on about the importance of watering plants, particularly in containers and straw bales where the roots can't leave that area to go find water elsewhere. And this is what causes blossom end rot. So yes, it's due to calcium, a calcium deficiency, but usually your planting environment, your soil has plenty of calcium. It's just that a stressed plant can't access it. So by being really careful about your watering and making sure those plants are not wilting during the hottest parts of the day, you will almost entirely eliminate blossom end rot, which will make you happy. However, if you do have a first few fruit on a plant that have it, those tomatoes are perfect for seed saving, because blossom end rot is a physiological issue that's due to conditions, not the genetic material in the seeds. And if you would, so that plant on the left is, I'm sure it's Livington's favorite, which is a rare variety, and I can let that ripen a little more, do seed saving on that tomato, and next year, if I were to be a little more careful about my watering, the tomatoes would come out just fine. Cracking, which is shown here on the right, and that is radial cracking. That happens when you go for the vine ripe tomato. Pick your tomatoes half ripe, the breaker stage. Bring them in your kitchen, leave them on your counter, and within 2 days, they'll fully ripen up. If you want, you can put them in a bag with an apple or a banana, because the ethylene gas that the fruit gives off is also the ripening hormone for tomatoes. You'll have crack-free, beautifully ripe tomatoes whose flavor is indistinguishable from those that you would let ripen on the vine. When you don't pick at the breaker stage, you have this. And tomatoes with these deep cracks are going to be more perishable, and they won't last as long on the shelf. So we're right around at the top of the hour, and I have the good fortune of being able to do this tonight because my grandfather, Walter Gibbs, on the left, this was his 50th wedding anniversary with my grandmother, Elsie, and my father, Wilfred, on the right, and that's me, probably when I was 2 or less. They took me into their gardens when I was very young, and it was captivating. It's, while all my friends were playing with trucks and stuff, I was just being amazed at staring iris and morning glories and sweet peas right in the face. And it caught. The seed that they planted in me caught, germinated, and my wife and I had our first garden in 1981, just after we were married, and we've gardened together ever since. So your simple task is to grow a gardener yourself. And what Master Gardeners groups do are so important these days. I have this view that gardeners are going to have to save the world because we seem to be the only collective group that can get together in a common cause and do great things together. If anybody wants a signed book for me, they can just drop me an email, and I have these both in stock all the time. And here, I'm going to show my favorite tomatoes for the next 2 slides while we do some Q&A, but I've got my website on here. I've got my email, and the Instagram lives haven't settled in terms of which day yet. I've been doing a lot of Zooms and a lot of in-person talks, and the weather's been unsteady, but pretty soon I think I'll be settling into Friday afternoons at 3. They're 45 minutes. I'm at NC Tomato Man, and I just sit in my garden, do a show and tell, and take questions. The online Growing Epic Tomato course is launched and evergreen now. So you can just go into that website, organicgardeningacademy.com, Growing Epic Tomatoes. If you use Craig 150, you get $150 off. It is long. It is over a dozen modules. Each one has over a dozen videos. It's all video. It has its own community where you can ask Joe and I questions all the time. It was a really fun course to do. And book number 3 in the Dwarf Tomato Project is underway, and it will be self-published. So I'm going to pause for questions, but I'm going to put up my current favorite tall growing tomatoes for flavor. And I really want to thank Karen and Stacy for the banter beforehand, for inviting me to do this. And I hope everybody got a little something out of this that they will find useful. Thank you for your attention and for attending.
So I'm sorry, it took me a moment there.
Oh, no problem.
I want to thank you. First of all, thank you so much. What a fantastic presentation. And we have a few questions that have come
Sure.
in.
I told you to buckle up because so these allow me to take a book I wrote 11 years ago, is 11, and make it live and share all of the things I've learned since. So it is fun to do this, and I appreciate it, Karen. And I'm ready for questions.
Okay, the first we have is, should I avoid watering with super cold water? Also, time of day for watering.
Super cold is probably fine. Time of day, as long as you're not wetting foliage, you really don't want to get your leaves wet when it's 100 degrees out and the sun is beating down, but it's when the plant looks thirsty. So I like to water in the morning, but if it's going to be 98 that day with humidity and my plants I'll go out at 1 or 2 and give them a drink, and they'll be really appreciative for it. Sometimes the evenings are nice and the birds are singing, and I'll go out and just top the plants up a little bit at in the evening at 4 or 5 or 6. The thing is, if you're in a container or a straw bale, any excess is going to just drain through. So you don't have to worry about the plant getting too much. It's when you're in a traditional garden or a raised bed where the plant is going to tell you a little bit how dry it is. So don't worry about the super cold, and don't worry about being specific about when.
Terrific. Craig, what are those tomato seedlings with the maroon stems in the foreground of the photo of the tray with many, many seedlings?
Oh, let's go back to that. Well, let I'm going to pause. We'll go back to that at the end, but because it may not be a tomato. It may be something totally different. So let's go back to that picture after we do a few more. And I'm going to change this to be my favorite dwarf tomatoes for flavor. So this is tough. I've got 157 babies that I've helped create, and I have to pick my favorite, what is that, 14 for flavor. And again, I'll come back to the picture because we'll give this a few minutes, then I'll do that, Karen. I've got it written down so I won't forget.
Okay. Somebody said they've had their grandson in the garden since 6 months old, so we know that people in our area are
Yes,
bringing along our next generations.
great.
Someone said I may have missed how often to feed. Please and thank you.
Yeah. So, so I mentioned it in the regular garden, and I would say every 3 weeks or so if you're in a dirt garden. Tomatoes aren't the heaviest feeders, and in a dirt garden, the roots can find it when it flows deeper. I'm feeding weekly in containers and straw bales, and I'm using about 1.5 cups of all-purpose solution per plant per week. And I find that keeps the plants happy. But that's what I'm doing. And if others of you out there are using a different material and a different regular watering or feeding period, go for it, and share it with me. When you get into things like what you feed with, what you spray with, and all that, man, it's so tied up into each person's experience and philosophy. So I keep it pretty high level in general and just share what I do. I use the blue stuff, 1.5 cups of solution, 1 tablespoon per gallon, 1.5 cups per plant each week in a container and straw bale. And I was getting 30 to 35 pounds of tomatoes per plant in a straw bale, meaning 70 pounds of tomatoes in a straw bale, which I'm pretty happy with that yield.
Wow. There are several compliments, which I'm sure you will see up in there in the chat. And you've answered some of the questions about cracking fruit and wilt. The last question I've found here is I planted potatoes 2 years ago, and I feel we removed all the potatoes from the soil. I then planted pole beans in the same area to add nutrients naturally. Should I plant, or can I plant my tomatoes near the area I'm concerned?
I think as long as you haven't had any problems with the potatoes, I think you should be fine. I think potatoes, you'd really know it if they had late blight. And what I find, it's usually kind of farmers who don't have, they have big old farms and they haven't been too good about their garden maintenance, and they just let stuff lay around. Those are the places that are more likely. But if you're a good gardener, I think you should be fine with that. And it's either this picture or, this picture probably. On the right, the plant with the white and purple and green leaves, that is yeah, you can see that, right?
Mhm.
That is I've heard it, it's a member of the Tradescantia family, so a member of spiderworts. I think people have grown perennial spiderworts. Other people know the plant it's kind of a funny name, Wandering Jew, which makes me cringe, but there it is. These plants have names that you don't know how they get them. But we keep this out, we bring it in. They grow about 6 feet long, and we bring it in during the winter, and I just have it in the basement, and it lives, even though it's only getting a little bit of fluorescent light. And so I don't put it in the garden. I leave it in containers because it's pretty tender. Everything else here, you see the tomatoes that I haven't separated out yet, in clusters, and some I have. And you see my single labels. Each one of those labels are all the tomatoes in that row. So if you garden long enough, you have these little systems. And then when you show people what you're doing, they're like, how do you not get them mixed up? And what are you doing with there? So I love to be able to I use my Instagram lives a lot of time to explain, you know, when I show my planting tray with no sticks in it, they're like, how do you know what's planted in what cell? And it's the Excel spreadsheet, it's the pad, it's the numbers, it's all of the sciencey stuff that I use to keep stuff straight. So I'm a geek and a nerd about this, hand up, confession, guilty as charged, but you know, makes it fun to, as a scientist, gardening is both right and left brain for me. It's the beauty of seed saving and understanding what these varieties are doing, but then it's the colors and the flavors and the fun that's cooking with them and the story. So not many hobbies let you satisfy so many itches, to tell you the truth.
Our next question, oh, actually, I think this was a tag on to the previous. I had my soil tested and needed a lot of lime. How many other
Oh.
nutrients should I add prior to planting my tomatoes? And have you used comfrey for tomatoes?
Wow. I've not used comfrey, but I've heard that is it potassium? Is it phosphorus? There is some, and I've heard that you can make a tea that has a pretty balanced nutrient. So I would say that's one I can either research or let you know, or I would say just Google that one. Lots of people have told me about comfrey, but have not done that. As far as the soil being tested, you say you need some calcium. If you work compost in and just use some NPK just to balance fertilizer, I think that's off to a good start. If you wanted, you could send to the extension, the ag extension, and have them do a soil test so they could actually let you know if you have sufficient nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium from their recommendations for growing a crop like tomato. And then there are certain things you could use to adjust up on any one of those three if one of them have a complete deficit. But yeah, drop me an email and let me know how it goes. I love to know how people's adventures are in the garden.
Where do you source your potato leaf yellow seed? I can't seem to find it.
I'll tell you the story of potato leaf yellow. So a woman named Barbara Lund in Ohio sent me yellow brandywine and potato leaf yellow in 1990 as a seed savers exchange. She had neither of them listed, so she wrote me a letter saying that she got them from gardeners in Ohio, and I loved them. But then I started growing so many varieties that I let my seed get to the point where it wouldn't germinate anymore. And I wanted to go back and grow it. So I wrote to the Seed Savers Exchange saying, hey guys, I'm your tomato advisor. Can you send me some potato leaf yellow? And they sent me seed that I sent them in 1992 that they had frozen. So it's so cool. The circle went completely around. I sent it to Victory Seeds and they're going to grow it out. So my view is it should end up in a seed catalog in a year or two. The other way to get it is I'm growing it this year. I'm out of seeds pretty much right now, but I could maybe spare 2 or 3. So the person who asked the question, send me an email with your address and I will send you some.
That is terrific. Let's see. That somebody thinks that it was the picture with the purple was actually the community pots of seeds. So that there were
well,
I don't know where that was exactly in the
yeah. Maybe further on.
and you were showing how you propagate and
let's go there.
Started.
Sorry, everybody close their eyes so you don't get dizzy.
Earlier on,
Just like this.
Right there.
Was earlier on, Craig.
Okay. Wait a minute.
We had a gazillion seedlings in one tray.
Yeah, let me go a little there. Oh, wait a minute. I know that.
Yes.
Thank you. See, my brain isn't as addled as it can be sometimes. Those are either beets, which they may be Detroit red beet. They also could be, they are beets. So that bright yellow one is Burpee Golden. And to the right of it, actually, where there's some different colors in there, is probably charred bright lights where you can get purples and yellows and whites. But But this actually, I'm glad you raised that because this is an example of how I use the dense planting technique for beets. And so what I'll do is separate them out and I'll fill a 50 plug tray with the planting mix, and I'll put one beet plant in each, and I'll give it about a month. And then you get these perfect little beet plants. So you can just pop out the bottom, put them in your garden every 3 inches apart, and then you don't have to do any weeding or any thinning, and you get these perfectly round cylindrical 3-inch beets. So I even tried transplanting carrots, and even though they say you can't do it, it works just fine. So one of the things about gardening is watch out for what people tell you can't do. Be curious and try it. The worst that will happen is you'll say, yeah, you're right, it doesn't work. The best thing they can say is, aha, I found a new little technique that everybody says doesn't work, but it really does work for me. So play in the garden, use it as your laboratory, discover things, and just have a blast with it.
Are there any local tomato tasting events in either North Carolina or Virginia that you can recommend?
You know, we did Tomato Palooza in Raleigh for 10 years, and it started off as people who bought my plants wanted to know what the other varieties tasted like. So everybody who bought my plants brought produce, and we just got together and tasted them. By the time it was 10 years, it grew to 250 varieties, 300 people, and so much work that we couldn't do it anymore because everybody pitches in at first, and then when people find it something to attend, less people help you out, and almost all the tomatoes I grew ended up being tasted, and we had no more. So it was a great 10-year run. We learned a lot, but in Hendersonville out here, we actually did a few. This year with only 12 varieties, I'm probably not going to do it. But, you know, I know that Monticello will often have or that area will often have a tomato tasting. I would just, you know, Google tomato tastings, check out other master gardener groups. There's so much fun to do. And if there's any tomato festivals that are happening in your area, because a lot of downtowns or farmers markets will often run a tomato festival, tomato weekend. And a lot of times they will host a, you know, a tasting, you know, or for, you know, $100,000, I will come out to the place of, no, I won't. But tomato tastings are a blast. And I do hope you find one. You know, use Nextdoor, use Google, and just, you know, look for whatever farmers markets are in your vicinity, all the little towns, and see if you can find one. Because, you know, and let me know if you do. I'd love to pass that information on.
And the last, would you please show the slide with your book cover again?
Sure, we can
And
do
Stacy,
that.
for those who haven't noticed, Stacy has put Craig's website up on in the chat, so you should be able to find that very easily.
Let's see. See, these things, I have like 150 slides, and I have to pick out 70 to show, and I'd like to show all 150, but there they are. Yeah, you know, it's I always have a box or two of each, and you know, I'm really happy to. And when people order books, they tip it right now for $25. You get both books and 6 packs of seeds. So it's a good deal right now. Signed books. It's just that I want to get it out there for people. And I figure if Story gets enough feedback, maybe they'll ask me to write an update to Epic Tomatoes, because I've asked them. It's still selling, and it's so expensive. So we're not ready to have you refresh it yet. So publishers, what can you say? Out of my control.
Thank you for staying on an
Oh,
extra
yeah.
17 minutes. We are so fortunate to have had you here all this while. And thank you to everyone who attended. Craig, I look forward to seeing you back this way
Yeah.
sometime.
Let's do it. You know, so one piece of feedback you can give me, I did this talk pretty much 7 or 8 years ago. Has it changed much through the years? What do you think?
I was kind of a novice then, and
Ah,
tomatoes were not something I had had a lot of success with. I have
cool.
kind of a moderate success level with tomatoes.
Yeah.
So I've been taking copious notes.
Oh, cool.
But
Well, for everybody on the call, I am seriously only an email away, and I try to get to everybody's email within 24 hours. And part of the fun of doing what I do is kind of being the country's tomato consultant, but making friends along the way and seeing their baby pictures of their garden. And it creates a community that's kind of sorely lacking these days. So it's a happy place for me to do this.
well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so
Good.
very much.
All right,
Until
everybody.
next time. Thank you
Great
so
gardening.
much. Happy
Bye-bye.
gardening. Good
Yeah.
night.